Welcome to Baha'i Chat, a conversation series dedicated to our interconnectedness. It's an uplifting moment when we can turn our thoughts to ideas that advance us toward the oneness of humanity and a just, diverse, united world in which every person and every community is spiritually and materially prosperous and flourishing. Each weekly session explores the expression of one or more principles of the Baha'i faith, the fundamental teachings of which include the oneness of God, religion, and humanity. On each episode, we feature people who are putting these principles into action or whose work touches upon them in some way. I'm Layli Maparyan, co-host of today's program. Over a century and a half ago, Baha'u'llah, founder of the Baha'i faith, penned tens of thousands of prayers and tablets comprising some 500,000 words and filling 100 volumes, which have since been translated into over 800 languages. The single overriding theme in these teachings is the oneness of humanity, and recognizing the impediments to the realization of this high ideal, Baha'u'llah placed a great deal of emphasis on how to achieve the betterment of the world. Among Baha'u'llah's writings is this quote: "The remedy the world needeth in its present day afflictions can never be the same as that which a subsequent age may require. Be anxiously concerned with the needs of the age ye live in, and center your deliberations on its exigencies and requirements." Baha'u'llah's ministry, which spanned 1863 to 1892, coincided with many important historical events that shaped race and racism as we know it today. For example, in 1863, this is the year that the US President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, although we know that it wasn't until 2.5 years later, on June 19, 1865, that its message of freedom reached many of the people of African descent who had been subjected to enslavement in the United States, a fact we are now commemorating with the new Juneteenth US federal holiday. In a similar vein, the latter half of the 19th century also witnessed the scramble for Africa, when the 7 major powers of Europe drew boundaries on the African continent, dividing numerous African tribes arbitrarily and consolidating the already deleterious European colonial regimes across the continent. The mid-19th century also bore witness to the Trail of Tears, or Indian removal, in the United States, as members of diverse Native American tribes were forced from their ancestral lands, stripped of their sovereignty, and moved to barren areas. Last but not least, in the United States, the late 19th century saw the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which barred Chinese immigrants from relocating to the United States, despite decades of Chinese labor exploitation, particularly in the building of the transcontinental railroad system in the United States. Baha'u'llah was certainly aware of these developments, and his own writings were revolutionary insofar as they illuminated the equality of all human races and the unreality of race as a form of division amongst men. Baha'u'llah referred to Black people as the pupil of the eye through which the light of the spirit shineth forth. Abdu'l-Baha, Baha'u'llah's eldest son and chosen successor, further elevated the Baha'i discourse on race during the early 20th century by stating unequivocally that color was of no spiritual consequence and exhorting all followers of the faith to eradicate prejudice in all its forms. Focusing on the construct of race amity, Abdu'l-Baha lauded and encouraged early US Black believers and highlighted the spiritual importance of indigenous populations, especially during his visit to the United States in 1912 during the heart of the Jim Crow era. On this visit, he spoke to many African American audiences at conferences, historically Black colleges and universities, and in informal personal gatherings. And he set the example for the North American Baha'i community by personally integrating all white meetings and social events by inviting African American attendees. He later charged Baha'is in Washington, D.C. with holding the first Race Amity Convention in 1921, the 100th anniversary of which we just celebrated last month. Succeeding Abdu'l-Baha was his grandson, Shoghi Effendi, a descendant in the lineage of both the Bab, Baha'u'llah's herald, and Baha'u'llah himself. Between 1921 and 1957, Shoghi Effendi, who came to be known as the guardian of the Baha'i faith, extended the reach of the cause to nearly every continent, country, island, and tribe on earth, including many indigenous populations. In his writings to Baha'is all over the world, he exhorted and adjured all Baha'i communities, especially those in the United States, to the highest standards of racial equality, racial integration, and racial justice. In this way, racial justice and the eradication of all forms of racism became central pillars of the global Baha'i community and its way of life. Shoghi Effendi himself traversed the African continent north to south twice without once setting foot in the United States, and throughout his life communicated the signal importance of people of African descent and indigenous people to the realization of the oneness of humanity. Today, the Universal House of Justice, the supreme governing body of the global Baha'i community, regularly offers guidance on the achievement of just, diverse, united communities and institutions. In fact, this time last year, the Universal House of Justice wrote a letter to the Baha'is of the United States in which it asserted the following: racism is a profound deviation from the standard of true morality. It deprives a portion of humanity of the opportunity to cultivate and express the full range of their capability and to live a meaningful and flourishing life, while blighting the progress of the rest of humankind. It cannot be rooted out by contest and conflict. It must be supplanted by the establishment of just relationships among individuals, communities, and institutions of society that will uplift all and will not designate anyone as other. The change required is not merely social and economic, but above all, moral and spiritual. It is in this spirit that we offer today's program. Today's guest, Jon W. Jones, is an accomplished and acclaimed painter who has made the illumination of harsh racial truths, as well as the depiction of Black nobility, the hallmarks of his extensive corpus. Through his artistic eye, we are able to peer back in history and explore the roots of today's racial ideology. By looking through the lens of his depictions, we are able to deepen our analysis of how things came to be as they are and what we can do to change them. Let me now formally introduce him. Mr. Jones was born in 1950 in Columbia, South Carolina, and has been a freelance artist and illustrator for more than 25 years. As a multi-talented artist, he uses oils, acrylics, and watercolors for his paintings. Striving for detail in light and reflection, he meticulously draws each painting first and then layers it with color, resulting in very realistic interpretations of everyday life and landscapes, as well as historical insights into our past. Mr. Jones's work is the focus of a traveling exhibition, Confederate Currency, The Color of Money, Images of Slavery in Confederate and Southern States Currency. Currently on display at the African American Museum in Dallas, the exhibition has been featured in some 260 well-respected and top media outlets, including the New York Times, Time Magazine, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Boston Globe, CNN, and National Public Radio. In April of 2017, Mr. Jones was presented with the U.S. Consul General's Award for Cultural Diplomacy by the Accademia delle Belle Arti of Brera in Italy. My co-host today is Dr. Derik Smith, so well known to so many viewers of Baha'i Chat. But for those of you who are meeting him for the first time today, Derik is a professor in the Department of Literature at Claremont McKenna College and chair of the Intercollegiate Department of Africana Studies at the Claremont Colleges. He writes about American literary culture with a particular interest in poetry. His latest book is Robert Hayden in Verse, New Histories of African American Poetry and the Black Arts Era, published in 2018 by the University of Michigan Press. He has also published two highly regarded articles in the Journal of Baha'i Studies, 2019's Centering the Pupil of the Eye, Blackness, Modernity, and the Revelation of Baha'u'llah, and the just published New Black Power, Constructive Resilience, and the Efforts of African American Baha'is. Derik is also a brand new auxiliary board member of the Baha'i Continental Boards of Counselors. I will now turn it over to Derik to get today's conversation started.
Well, thank you so much, Layli, for that beautiful introduction and the backdrop for our discussion today that we're going to have with the artist Jon Jones. And like you, Layli, I find Jon to be just a generous and gracious person who is willing to share his time and give insight into his artwork with all who come asking. And I find that in and of itself to be a very beautiful element of his personality. Over the past few months, I've gotten to know Jon a little bit through this Zoom interface, and I can feel the warmth and the depth of his engagement every time I'm on with him. And when I first came across the project that we're going to be looking at today, I was immediately drawn to it because I think it deals with issues that are so central to this transitional moment that we're having in America as we come to grips with a new understanding of the history that we are coming out of and that we inherit today. And in order to maybe help our viewers understand Jon's corpus a little bit better, I wanted to think about a couple of ideas in terms of our own understanding of American history and the centrality of the institution of slavery in that history, and also the role that Black people have played in the creation of the American nation. So it seems to me that there are several kinds of suppressions which have played a key role in the way that the nation has come to understand itself, right? Particularly where Black people are concerned and this institution of slavery is concerned. And one could say that the first suppression, one that existed during the period of enslavement, and then after that, was the suppression of the reality of the brutality of the institution itself, right? And merely the idea that this was something that was a blot on the history of the nation. It was sometimes described as a benign institution. Um, and that's been a kind of ongoing suppression, even just recognizing the reality and the horror of the institution has been something that's suppressed. Now, Jon's body of work engages with that suppression in a real sort of fundamental way. He surfaces the reality of enslaved people in the 19th century in a really incredible and dynamic way through his painting. But then there's also a secondary kind of suppression, which has still is still quite prominent in American understanding of itself and of its history, and that is the centrality of enslavement in the creation of the nation. So there are some kinds of narratives about America, the American past, which would let us understand that yes, slavery existed. It was an unfortunate institution, and it was marginal to the true narrative of the rise of American greatness and American power from the 19th century onward, when in fact that itself could be seen as a kind of suppression. And what the reality may be is that enslavement of African descended people in America was actually not marginal, but central to the rise of the nation in terms of its economic power and political power on the world stage. And what Jon's work does is key us into the connection between the central role of enslaved labor in the rise of American economic power in the 19th century by depicting images of Black people laboring in the American South that are lifted from the currency of Confederate states. So, what we will see in the work that we're going to explore with Jon is the way in which the currency notes that were circulating, not just in the South, but that went into the northern parts of America as well, had on them depictions of enslaved people doing the work. And so, one of the things that immediately sparked my mind with new thoughts about is that the people who were doing the enslaving in the southern states were fully aware of the way in which Black people and their enslavement was key to their economic power. right? Because they put it on the banknotes. And these banknotes, as I said, were not just circulating in the southern states. They also were circulating into northern states as well. And one of the things that we have to begin to understand then is that it wasn't just the southern economy that was powered by the engine of enslaved labor, right? In fact, because of the way in which the plantation economies of the South were so central to American economy at that time, they played that plantation slavery played a role in shaping the entirety of the American economy. And one could say even the global economy, as banking structures that went from places like Zurich and London and other places in the European continent were entangled with and required for the emergence of economic power in America in the 19th century. And so what Jon's work does is really, again, key us on to that connection. Now, the other thing that's so engrossing about this artistic project is that it is so vast. There are literally hundreds of images that Jon has brought to life. And by doing that, one of the things that comes to mind is that this was a vast, we begin to get a sense of the vastness, right, of enslaved labor in the creation of economic power. It's not just 3 or 4 or 5 or a dozen or 2 dozen images that Jon has given us, but in fact, hundreds of them. And so when we begin to look at these images a little bit more, one of the things that we should begin to recognize is the way in which this project has forced us into a confrontation with this stark reality of the connection between economic power and the enslavement of African people, African descended peoples in the New World and in America particularly. Now, in the context of Baha'i Chat, I think this is a wonderful recognition for us to grapple with because, as Layli had pointed out before, the purpose of the Baha'i faith and the purpose of our shows here is to get us to a place where the greater unification of all of humanity is possible, where we, as Layli put it before, come to the understanding that the categories of race are on the one hand deeply consequential to our realities today, but yet on the other hand are mythical, right? They are fabrications that were put in place in order to justify our modern conceptions of race, are fabrications that were put into place in order to justify an exploitation. And that exploitation has now given rise to all of the reality which we have inhabit in this nation, plays such a key role in our understanding of so much of the sociality and the politics of America in the contemporary moment. So what we're going to have the opportunity to do now is to talk with Jon a little bit about his project. As I said, he's such a gracious guide into his work. And so I just wanted to bring in Jon Jones here. Thank you so much for being with us. I hope that we have done justice, a little bit of justice to the project which you have undertaken here over the last few decades. And what I wanted to do to just start out with is just get a couple of thoughts from you about, if you could tell us a little bit about the journey that took place as you became an artist. How did you come into artwork at all?
Well, thank you, Derik, and thank all of you all for joining us here today and to honor the lives of our ancestors, and thank everybody that helped make this possible. I'm basically a self-taught artist from Columbia, South Carolina. I started drawing paint when I was about 6 years old. My father wouldn't allow us to use school paper to draw on, so I cleared me a space on the ground and just started drawing on the ground. And that's how I basically learned how to draw. All through elementary school and high school, the teachers realized that I had some talent, so they kept me busy doing their bulletin boards and backdrops for school plays and that sort of thing. After graduating from high school in 1968, I received a wonderful letter from the President of the United States inviting me to participate in the Vietnam conflict. In other words, I was drafted. And I spent 8 years in the military. I got out of the military in 1978, and I worked as a freelance artist and illustrator in the Washington, D.C. area for about 12 years. I left Washington in about 1989 and moved back to my hometown, Columbia, South Carolina. I worked as a senior cartographer at the University of South Carolina for about 5 years. And then I got married and moved to Summerville, South Carolina, and this is where the story begins.
Thanks, John. If I could just ask one question about your biography there. Were you practicing your art? Were you creating art while you were in the military in that period from 68 to 78? Was that part of what you were doing in any fashion?
Absolutely. I was, when I first went into the military, I was 11 Bravo, which is some people call 11 Bullet Stopper. But I went to Vietnam as an infantry soldier. When I returned from Vietnam, I changed my MOS to 81 Echo, which is Army Illustrator. And in Korea, I was given the project of creating a wall for the bicentennial celebration in 1976. And I created a wall on the side of the telecommunications building in Seoul, Korea. And that got some play in the USA Today paper and the Army newspapers and some of the television programs around the Seoul, Korea area.
And we know that your artwork has received a lot of attention from media outlets, and we'll get to that later on in the discussion. So one of the things that I think probably is worthwhile for our audience to understand is how you came to this project, which, as I said before, takes these images off of the notes of Southern currency of the 19th century and then blows them up onto the canvas in these really spectacular ways. How did you come to that project in and of itself, the Color of Money series?
Well, this journey started for me in about 1996 while I was working as a graphic artist in a blueprint company in North Charleston, South Carolina. After I enlarged a Confederate a note for a customer of mine, I found myself looking at a picture of slaves picking cotton. And now I've seen Confederate money before, but I never took a closer look at the images that were on these old notes. Intrigued and excited, I started to researching and documenting the use of slaves on Confederate and Southern states money. And I was astonished by the widespread use of these images on these old currencies, and even more shocked by the absence of this information in any history books. The engravings on the notes were so small that if you wasn't really looking for them, they would be very easily missed. So I decided to recreate the images and bring them back to life to show so that people could see what I was looking at on these old notes, essentially. I approached Dr. Marvin Delaney, director of the Avery Research Center in North Charleston, South Carolina, about putting on an exhibition of these paintings on paper of money. And my main challenge was how was I going to make picking cotton exciting? And my response has been to present the engravings as originally portrayed on the currency without revisions. In these paintings, history informs art, which in turn reveals more history. And it has sometimes been said that the history of a country is reflected in its money. Well, that was certainly true in the earlier phases of American paper money and the images of slaves that we find in these old notes. Cotton and slaves were the foundations upon which the economy of the South was built. They were very important properties, proudly displayed on their paper money. Slavery, obviously, was very important to the South because, after all, it was on their money. And it's been there for more than 150 years. And I use this old cliche all the time. It's right on the money. The enslaved image shows the slaves as being happy, well-treated, and healthy workers in a quote-unquote unnatural state of bliss. You never see anything about the darker side of slavery in any of these images, like people being sold and slaves being whipped or that sort of thing. These images of slavery of the artists of that period are similar to the work of present-day photojournalists, except the positive slave images were being used as propaganda. They were designed to actively affirm and aggressively promote the slave labor system of their plantation economy. Now, very few people are aware that during the 1800s, during the free banking era, lax federal, state, and banking laws allowed almost anybody to print money. States, private banks, railroad companies, timber companies, and individuals could issue their own currency. By the 1860s, an estimated 8,000 different state banks were circulating currency all over the country, engraved with images like laborers, farmers, bare-chested women, ships, trains, statesmen, and the mythical figures. Of the thousands of images engraved on paper money, only the 13 Confederate states chose to engrave images of slaves on their currency.
And I believe the first one that we wanted to show represents, this is the first of the bills that you sort of brought to life, so to speak. Can you tell us a little bit about this bill?
Yes, this is the very first note that any African American has appeared on. It was from around 1820. After this note was issued in 1820, there were no other notes or records of slaves on any paper money until around the 1850s. But by the 1850s, the northern states had began seeing slavery as a primary component to a Southern agenda. Southerners began seeing the North as a threat to their way of life, sanctioned in history and inscriptions. But these images show no subjugation or anything. Blacks and whites sort of seem to be working in a congenial atmosphere. Now, I'm not sure what the meaning of this big old baby here in the middle is about, but I suspect that they were probably babysitting or something like that.
So here we have your depiction. Is there anything that you would say about this painting, like that comes from that note?
Well, like I said, I don't know what the meaning of this big red baby in the middle is, but I think that was what was on the note, so I added that in, and I also added the sky colors, and I use a lot of different sky colors in a lot of paintings. This one here shows a relatively serene atmosphere that the slaves were working in.
In the next image here, maybe we could talk a little bit about what is going on here, because you've done quite a bit of research into the history of these currency notes. Could you kind of explain for us what's happening here?
These are called recycled images. If you notice the very first note, there's a white farmer with a basket of corn. But the note beneath that, from Howardsville, Virginia, you see the same identical guy, but his skin color has been changed. And instead of being a white farmer, he's now a slave or with tattered clothing and so forth. These are called recycled images.
Right. So as I understand it, some of the earliest images of enslaved people on the Confederate currencies were simply lifted from other currencies, and then these figures who are oftentimes white are then sort of made out to be Black and then put on the Southern currency.
Absolutely. Well, that was because when this first all started, there were no images of African Americans to put on their money because they didn't have any ready-made images. So they had to do the next best thing, and that was to find images that they already had and then change them. But as this progressed, then they were beginning to specifically make images designed for these old currencies.
Yeah, it kind of makes you recognize that in those Southern societies, there was no sense of shame at all about the institution. In fact, it was something that they were quite proud of, that they would, highlight it on the currency itself, right? Can we
Absolutely.
see the image that you created from these?
I got a lot of faces and images from around the neighborhood. Some of my neighbors had some of these faces. This was just one of the paintings that I did for that. I had a little bit of artistic license in some of these things because the image is so small that you have to use a little artistic license in some of these paintings.
Yeah, I've noticed that, that you kind of add these flourishes from your own, mind in terms, particularly around the colors and the nuances of the expressions in the figures. And it kind of, each one of these has your own signature sort of touch to it, right?
Absolutely, certainly does.
there are so many images as we spoke of earlier, and what we thought we could do is just go through, a whole bunch of them, because one of the things that I think is so fascinating about your project is the variety of labor that we see enslaved people doing in these paintings. And so I thought maybe we could go through a few of them, and you could give us a few ideas about the work as you conceived it when you were creating the paintings here. So can you tell us a little bit about these notes?
Yes, absolutely. These two notes are also recycled images. If you take a
Mhm.
good close look at it, the top note, you see a field full of farmers out in the field, and a guy on a horse just casually riding by. But take a look at this bottom note from Winsboro, South Carolina. The middle ground has been changed. Instead of being a field full of wheat farmers, it's now a field full of slaves. And instead of him being just a casual rider by on a horse, he's now an overseer with a whip.
And then you've brought this to life in this painting here, and we can see again sort of the way in which the sky becomes so prominent in this image, and the way in which you have embellished it, so to speak, with your own vision. Can you say anything about
Mhm.
this work that you've done here to transcribe it into the artistic form here?
Well, here again, this is like you said, this is one of the recycled images, and I use a lot of the sky colors to provoke different feelings from the audience. Because what I wanted to do, I think mainly was to make the paintings uh, draw you in and free you up to confront the very difficult subject of slavery without the fear of censorship.
Ah, right. So one of the things that you've tried to do is create the images in such a way that conversations will emerge op- from the observation, from the viewing of your painting. So you kind of have thought of them as a kind of a open space in which people can enter into, then to to get into dialogue about this history.
That's exactly what it has done. It gives people the opportunity to talk about slavery and engage in a dialogue about it because it's a very difficult subject to talk about.
Hmm.
I understand that, and I understood that when I was doing these paintings.
Thank you. Yeah, we had this image here, and I think that this is a chain gang plantation style prison setting in one of the largest state prisons in the South, Angola State Prison. And it seems as though
Right.
you have chosen this image in order to bring us into an understanding of the connection between contemporary realities and then some of the realities that are depicted in your paintings, right? Did you want to add anything to that?
Well, yeah. So that particular image just shows that not very much has changed. The guy's still on a horse, and he's a white overseer, while the slaves or prisoners uh, out there doing the work, which is essentially what was happening back in the 1800s.
Hmm. Now we've gone on to another image here that where we can see an enslaved figure right there in the center of the note. And can you tell us a little bit about this one?
This is I call this is from the state of South Carolina. I call this one the slaves cooking dinner, and the guy in the middle uh, is supposed to be Francis Marion the Swamp Fox, offering something to eat to some anonymous officer, and it looks like they're sweet potatoes or something that he's serving.
Yeah, this image, the way in which the figures are assembled with the sort of the regal dressed white um, military men here sort of standing upright, and then the enslaved cook there kind of on his knees. It reminds me of a lot of the kinds of images that we would see of African descended people from the 19th century and previous to that, where the great majority of them show uh, people in positions that are, somewhat submissive and inferior to others in their context. So this one is in keeping with that tradition of art, you could say, that was characteristic of American and European creators of those centuries. And then you have a painting as well.
That painting originally hangs in the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina. The original painting of this. It was not on money at first, and that's where they got that image from.
So the original painting that went on to the currency was in the Capitol building of South Carolina. Is that right? Am I understanding that correct?
The Citadel down in Charleston, South Carolina, the military academy down.
Oh, wow. So this is an original painting that then got transferred onto money, and now you have transposed the image from the money into your own painting.
Absolutely, yes, exactly what I did. Yes.
Are there ways that your painting is markedly different than the original painting?
Perhaps some of the colors and things like that, but otherwise, it's pretty much what I was seeing on the money, because I wanted to paint these pretty much exactly like I saw them on the currency without revision, so that people would really see what I was seeing.
Oh,
well, I have a little bit of artistic license in some of these things, because these colors don't show up when you're on these old monochrome engravings, so I have to embellish it with some of the colors that I choose.
Here is yet again another type of labor that's being undertaken, and we see again that sort of arrangement of figures where the Black person in the image is kind of in relationship to the white central figure at a kind of diminished stature. And so I think like this is again in keeping with that tradition of art making by mostly European painters of that time. So there's that image right in the center of that bill, and then you've created this painting from it.
Absolutely, and you're right, Derik. The images of African Americans in a lot of these images are either smaller or subservient in some way or another to the white overseers and the white farmers or whatever they may be.
And in a lot of
absolutely.
In a lot of those, it seems that there is almost no particularity or individuality to the particular the enslaved people who are being represented. But in your paintings, there is this great sort of life and vitality which comes into each of the figures, so that we can see them as individuals, not just as a blank Black figure. And one of the things also about this currency note, which is also true of many of the other ones that we looked at, is there are a lot of representations of indigenous Americans, Native Americans on these bills as well. It seems as though there was this strange effort to sort of gesture towards the recognition that these indigenous people were part of this kind of American matrix that was, coming into being in the 19th century. Do you have any thoughts about those, the Native American figures that you've seen in these bills?
Well, there are a lot of Native Americans on a lot of these different notes. And I'm thinking about maybe doing a series of paintings based on those as well, but that hadn't come across just yet, but I'm still thinking about it. This particular note here is something that's interesting, because if you're old enough, you probably remember doing this before. I know I did when I was a small child. I remember this being done as sort of community, a project that everybody in the community joined in. They put the hog in that barrel of hot water and scald all of his hair off, and then they get something and scrape all the hair off. And of course, they'd have someone to butcher the hog, and of course, you see it's a slave that seems to be doing that, and it's something that the whole community did, and everybody got some of the ham hocks and chitlins and all that good stuff that we enjoy eating. But that's something that I've actually done before.
I appreciate the sort of the dignity of the man as he's doing this kind of what we might think of as less than desirable work here. Yet at the same time, there is a kind of concentration and dignity to his bearing that is quite notable in the painting. So that's one of the things I appreciate about this one.
Asheville, Tennessee. This is not only were slaves used for harvesting cotton, they were also used for harvesting sugar cane and tobacco as well. So this is one of the images that shows that.
Yeah, so this is the harvesting of sugarcane, and we know that in the early period of New World enslavement, that particularly in the Caribbean, the sugarcane was the primary crop that was creating great wealth for the early colonizing nations like Portugal and Spain and France, particularly. And then, as you mentioned, also we get into tobacco. And eventually we get into King Cotton. This is another fascinating image because it represents something quite singular in the paintings that you've done and the currency that you came across. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, Derik, this one is the only known images of slaves working in an environment, in an industrial environment. And the reason for that is that the Southerners didn't think that African Americans were intelligent enough to operate machinery. If they were, what's the justification for keeping them in bondage? So that's why there's only one image like this that I found out of the hundreds and hundreds of images that I've looked at.
Yeah, this understanding that we come to, obviously, the primary work that enslaved people were doing in terms of wealth generation had to do with agricultural labor, but there also in the early 19th century we see the beginnings of industrialization, and in some of these factories we can be sure that enslaved people were working as well, and this is the one note which captures that, and then you've brought that to life here again with the individuality and distinctiveness of each of the enslaved people, being really something that draws my attention. Here now we get to King Cotton, and this is so important because in so many of the paintings that you've done, we see cotton with its central role in the Southern economy of the South coming to life. There are many, many, many paintings that you've done, again, representing the many, many images from the currency in which we see cotton as that commodity. And so if you can say a little bit about that, that would be great.
On this note from Alabama, the slave boy smiles at us. Surely he must be enjoying his work. And just as surely that work must be beneficial to him, for he was especially created by God to pick cotton. And this is typical of some of the kind of notes that were designed specifically for Confederate currency. This is a slave herding cotton bales. Notice the cotton plant proudly displayed at the side of the road so that the viewer was sure to get the point that cotton was king.
Yeah, one of the things that we, is so key to understanding of American economic history is the singular role that cotton played in the development of 19th century American power, right? Because it's the textile factories which are emerging in Britain primarily, but other parts of Europe are for the purposes of processing cotton. And that cotton was the most important commodity on the global scene at that point, with the emergence of threading and clothing that could be easily obtained by growing numbers of people who had the financial ability to do that. And the great majority of the world's cotton was actually being produced in the South, right, on these plantations. And it was being produced by through the labor of these enslaved Africans. And what you see in all of your or so many of the paintings, again, is like what I would call the ubiquity, right? You see cotton everywhere. Like in the backdrop of this painting, we can see just the white fields in the background, and here, as you said, like in the foreground, we see the cotton plant, and then between those we see the bales that's being carried out of the fields.
Here from a Charleston, South Carolina banknote, the slaves are loading cotton onto wagons, trains, ships, or for shipment to Europe. Cotton was a global commodity that traveled all over the globe. And in fact, the United States was the #1 cotton producer in the world.
And in this image, like, again, I'm looking to the sky because the sky is so much an area where you have taken sort of artistic liberty to sort of give each painting its own character. And here we see the filling of this smoke and perhaps I guess steam also from these ships that are then taking there's the train in the background there, and also the ship, which, as you said, are taking the cotton from the South out into this global network, right? And so again, as cotton is this primary commodity on the sort of the scene of global trade at that time. And then what your paintings help us to do is recognize that it was the enslaved labor of African people in America that was producing this cotton that then gets traded and leads into the rise of American power. So I really like the way that this painting helps us to recognize that this is not just something that was kind of domestic, right? It also had its tentacles into a global trading network. So I like this one a lot too.
Well, within the slaveocracy, exploitation was economic, political, social, cultural, even biological and physical in character. New groups of people, such as mulattoes, emerged and were enslaved, thereby expanding the numbers of the slave caste. In the image titled Slave Prophets, engravers recycled a classical mythical figure to legitimize slavery. Moneta, a Roman goddess of money, claims the riches of an enslaved labor system seen toiling in the background. There's the gold under her arms, gold at her feet, and cotton in her hand. They do the work, and she's got the money.
It seems to me that in this painting, you have made that goddess Moneta into a Black woman. Is that right? Am I understanding that correctly?
But yeah, that's just to show the connection between the exploitation of females and the slaves.
Right. One of the things that we have noted is, historians are becoming more and more aware of the centrality of the labor of Black women in cotton fields, right? It wasn't just as though, it was men who were doing this work. In fact, it was oftentimes women, because of the kinds of skills that were necessary for cotton picking, were more efficient and more effective at cotton picking than men. And so it seems that in some ways it's appropriate, to have this Black woman here as the one who is holding the bag of money. Of course, in reality, the Black women who produce this commodity perhaps more efficiently and under more duress than even the enslaved men received none of the profits that are kind of centralized in this painting, but yet were the cause of it, the actual sort of source of these this profit. So by putting this Black woman at the middle, in the center of the painting, kind of draws our awareness to that, I think. So I think we have a few images here now of you with the all of the media attention that has been garnered by this project. And a lot of this came from some time ago, almost 2 decades ago. I can see this image from the New York Times, as I think is that 2001, is that right?
2001,
and so
yes, that's right.
your work has been recognized for quite some time. Are there certain kinds of media attention that you've received that you could say a little bit about?
Well, this has appeared in more than 300 newspapers, magazines, and televisions all over the country. The reaction that I've gotten from most people is that they were just as astonished as I was when I found these images, because a lot of people have never even seen Confederate money, let alone know what's on it. I could do something about to make people aware of what was going on these old notes, because I thought it was very important that people say nobody can really refute it because it was on their money. I didn't put it there. They put it there, and it's been there for more than 150 years. So it's been hidden in plain sight for all these years. It's sort of like a visual smoking gun. You just can't refute it.
Yeah, that's a great way of describing it, as this visual smoking gun. And I think that that may be one of the reasons that it has attracted, this particular project has attracted the attention of these media outlets. As you said, all this is right there under our noses, but yet somehow, because of the suppressive desires in American consciousness, we refuse to kind of keep on acknowledging it. So let me just ask you right now, like, where does the project stand? Are you still like finding new notes and adding to it, or you've been doing this for decades now? Like, what's your relationship to the creation of these images in this series?
Occasionally, I find something that I haven't seen before, and sometimes I rehash some of the ones that I've already done before. But I'm still working on this project on and off. But mostly, I'm doing a lot of Gullah-related paintings now, in a series of the Buffalo Soldiers. I've done the female Buffalo Soldier, Sister Kathy Williams. You may have heard about the first known female Buffalo Soldier. That one has been a very, very popular image that I've done. And many others. I've even done Colin Powell and Robert E. Lee together on a painting.
Okay, wow. So it seems to me like you're still involved in, whether it's in the Color of Money series or those that are outside of it, you're still sort of trying to bring to life some of these elements of American history that are particularly pertinent to Black history in America for an audience, in order to gain, so that we can have a deeper engagement with that history. That's one of the incredible things about your continued work as an artist.
Thank you, Doug. Absolutely. And I tell people all the time, I thought maybe I'd be known for something one day, but never in my wildest dreams did I think Confederate money was going to be it.
Yeah, but it's such a great service that you've rendered to so many by bringing this to life in such dramatic fashion. I think one of the things that we wanted to do before going into a Q&A period was call attention to Partners in Racial Justice. That is a nonprofit organization, which has organized to help promote your series by creating a website that can be used by people who are interested in, of course, just exploring the artwork themselves, but also for means of creating conversations and educational opportunities around the series, so we can think more deeply about the American history involving the enslavement of Black people, African Americans. And so if you go to onthemoney.org, you'll find a beautifully rendered website that captures many of the images that we were looking at just now and more, and also offers some brief background in text about the history and about the images themselves. So if anyone in the audience is really interested in engaging with these ideas and this artwork with more depth, please visit onthemoney.org.
Thank you, Derik. I think that what we can do, because some of the questions are so directly relevant to the images, that rather than taking a break, we'll just go ahead and jump into a few of the questions. I noticed early on that a number of people had questions about the indigenous people in the images. And even though, Jon, I know you said this wasn't really your focus right now, I was thinking we could go back and just look at them a little bit in the images, and maybe make a few comments about those, because I think that one of the important factors in this whole conversation is that during the same time that the images on this money were being used to create racial or racist ideology about African Americans, there was also the creation of racist ideology about Native Americans. And people who know about many of the different indigenous tribes and nations that were on the North American continent in the South there were the so-called 5 civilized tribes who often were farming, holding businesses, and even maintaining enslaved Africans of their own in these very areas. And if you look at the images of the Native Americans, I think we can see some of that history reflected. If you look closely on the left, you see a Native American person who is depicted here alongside the images of the Black and white people on the right. And this picture clearly sort of links to the narrative about Native Americans as a savage people, which was really in contradistinction to, particularly the so-called civilized tribes that were coexisting in the very lands that a lot of these white planters were working, but at the same time supporting this other sort of image of Native Americans as these sort of fierce warrior types. You see the spear there alongside this particular depiction. A lot of people asked about this image where a Native American person appears to be being held down by some white individuals behind the table where the enslaved African person is preparing dinner. And if you look at the dress of these individuals, you see that they are more clothed, which is a symbol of being more civilized in the iconography of the time, which does reflect the nearby presence of members of those nations, such as Cherokee and Creek. And often they were all agricultural landholders that employed or enslaved Black people as labor. And while they were not identical in the nature of those relations, they were 3 communities who were often interacting, and that is reflected in this money. Here's another where it appears on the right-hand side that a Native American is being depicted at the foot of a white woman. And again, we see this kind of imagery that is meant to show a subservient posture with regard to the Native American people. This is another racist sort of ideology of always showing people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color being beneath whites in some way, which was reinforced every time someone looked at one of these bills. A lot of the themes that you represented with regard to African Americans were also being reproduced with regard to the Native Americans of the time and of the area. So I hope that for those members of the audience who had curiosity about that we address those themes a little bit. Some other people asked Jon about some of the particulars on the money. So for example, one person asked about whether you exhibited the money with the paintings or whether you gave some consideration of direct appropriation of the money image so that it looked more like money with text than a painting. So can you just talk a little bit about how you displayed these two relative to each other and your artistic choices about the representation?
Well, to begin with, we displayed the currency juxtaposed to the painting as not a part of the painting. But as we progressed in this project, I started, in fact, I was down at the Martin Luther King historic site in Atlanta, and I used to go down occasionally and ask people, well, do you understand what's going on here? And most of them would say, well, not really. Mm-hmm. And then I had to point out to them that the images actually came from the currency. Mm-hmm. And then they began to get a new understanding of what was happening in these paintings. Mm-hmm. So after this exhibition ended, I decided to do some more images, but I decided to put the money actually on the painting itself, mm-hmm. so that they could not possibly miss where it came from. And, mm-hmm. and that was another very successful part of the exhibition.
And that really heightens the educational value of the artwork. And it shows how this artwork can be used to engender conversations and really increase our knowledge about facts of history that are often kind of swept under the rug. Another person asked a question. This is really about your artistic judgment. It said, how do you as an artist judge where to balance visual accessibility with the horror of enslavement? I'm sure that was a difficult choice that you had to think through. Can you talk a little bit about your process?
Well, doing these paintings, as I mentioned before, there's nothing about the harsher side of slavery in any of it. And that was done deliberately because they would use them as propaganda to promote the idea that slavery was really just wonderful. And you Southern people should Northern people should just leave us alone down here because our slaves are just fine. But we know that that's not the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was painting these things, all of these things ran through my mind, of course, but I was trying to be true to what I was seeing on the currency. That was my main focus at that time.
Somebody else asked about tobacco as a very large commodity that we also exported. I know that both you and Derik may want to weigh in about this with your particular unique knowledge about history.
Well, I did a couple of paintings with them carrying tobacco. One was Texas slave, and I think another one was slave mother and child. She has an arm full of tobacco. So tobacco was a very important commodity, particularly in the South, North Carolina, South Carolina, and other places that produce tobacco. So yes, it's a very important crop that the slaves were also responsible for gathering and harvesting.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I would add about tobacco in relation to cotton, right, is that we can think about tobacco as one of the primary crops that was raised up in the, let's say, that late part of the 18th century and the early part of the 19th century on the mid-Atlantic, more eastern region of the United States, the southeast United States, and also the mid-Atlantic region. And then remember, there's the Louisiana Purchase that happens early on in the 19th century. And when all that land opens up, right, it kind of coincides with the rise of industrialization in Europe. And it just so turns out that the land in the southern region of the United States is perfect for cotton production, and that can then be shipped over into Britain. And so what you see actually happen in the early part of the 19th century is, aside from the Great Migration of the early 20th century, where African Americans moved from the South to the North, what you see in the early part of the 19th century is another great forced migration of enslaved people moving from the mid-Atlantic coast into the southern region. You see tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people being moved over into that region of the US with the rise of cotton production, which dominates US economy for the next few decades of the 19th century up until the Civil War. So cotton becomes primary, displacing and far outpacing something like tobacco, which was earlier on in the 19th century and before.
Thank you, Derik. And, one of the things I just want to point out to the audience is that we certainly were not able to show all of Jon's 300 images in this series, in this presentation. But if you'd like to see more of them, you can go to onthemoney.org, or you can also look for his book, which is largely out of print, but if you search, you can still find it. I want to end with this question because I think it really sums up the purpose of today's program. And that is, Jon, how do you feel that your art can be most effective as a means for educating and unifying people across and within the color line?
Well, most importantly, I think it opens up a dialogue between people and gives them the opportunity to talk about these very, very disturbing issues of slavery. And as I said before, slavery is a very difficult subject to talk about. But I'm happy that it's being taught in different schools and institutions all over the country. In fact, my granddaughter called me one day and said, "Granddaddy, they teaching your stuff in my school." And I said, "Yeah, I know, baby. I know they've been doing it for a while."
Mm-hmm.
But she was very surprised by that. And at first, nobody believed her because they didn't think that she knew me. And then they asked, "Well, was I dead?"
Yeah.
I said, "No, I'm not dead." But this has been going on for quite some time, and I'm very pleased that it has gotten out into the public, particularly the high schools and I've even spoken at elementary schools before. My granddaughter invited me to her school to speak at her school once before.
Mm-hmm.
So I've done presentations in different venues all over the country.
Well, I'm very glad that we were able to bring your work to a wider audience today, and that we are able to, advance the cause of historical education, through this program.
Well, I just wanted to thank Jon again for taking the time to walk us through this incredible creation that you have shared with all of us. I really appreciate that. I appreciate you, Layli, for, as always, a masterful job of guiding and contextualizing all the conversation that we've had here, and especially then also to the audience who has tuned in to hear about this important work. Please, involve yourself with it through the website. That's been really is a gift, to this wide audience, and that can be used for sparking these meaningful conversations, which are necessary for us as we try to create communities of greater cohesion and justice and unity. So just thanks a lot, Jon and Layli, for the opportunity to be here with you.
Well, so true. And we want to thank you too, also, Derik, for your contributions to today's conversation. And I personally want to thank you, Jon, as well. And if you aren't already in connection with the Baha'i and would like a bit of virtual accompaniment in your personal investigation of the Baha'i faith, where you can ask questions, be guided to materials that would especially resonate for you, and be introduced to Baha'is and community building activities in your area, we invite you to connect with our Baha'i Guide program. You'll get a personal invitation to connect in whatever way you would like at a time that works for you. For more details, simply send us an email at info@baha'i.chat and write guide in the subject line. Thank you very much.